Hello, I'm Dr. Bradley-Popovich. I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce myself. My background is I have a bachelor's in biology with a minor in psychology, master's degrees in human nutrition and exercise physiology, and a doctorate in physical therapy with an emphasis in nutrition. But most importantly, I'm a dad, and I'm a father of a son with special needs, and I would like to provide an overview of what those needs are comprised of and how those impact his membership in DeMolay. I myself came up in DeMolay and probably share a diagnosis similar to my son, except the diagnosis was not in vogue during my era, but it certainly made for, I think, a more difficult period of adolescence than it needed to be. And so I hope that this video is found to be instructive and helpful in preparing all DeMolay advisors for interacting with similar young men who need additional support. So specifically what we'll be talking about today is the autistic spectrum. It's a broad range of different disorders that have a variety of different characteristics that make individuals idiosyncratic. They stand out from the crowd, and we'll share a little bit of information, some anecdotes about some of those stories and how to possibly manage these young men. I'm also a DeMolay advisor myself, and so I deem this information helpful, hopefully, to other advisors in interacting with these youth. So first of all, autism seems like a discussion that might be better left to a medical office or a classroom environment. However, autism is so common in our society that most of us will brush up against an individual that has some sort of an autistic disorder just in the course of every day. For example, 1 out of 88 children now, and this is up from 1 in 100 just a few years ago, we're up to 1 in 88 children have some sort of diagnosis on the autism spectrum. Rates continue to climb. We're not completely sure why this is the case, if it has to do with better diagnostics or different criteria by which we judge these conditions, but we simply know that there are more and more individuals afflicted affected by these diagnoses. Autism affects 4 times as many boys as girls, so there's a very strong gender bias that would really impact DeMolay, for example. So many prospective DeMolays may have a related diagnosis to autism. Okay? They could be extremely high functioning. They could go for years without detection. Maybe they haven't had adequate workup, or maybe they're just so high functioning that they can mask some of their deficits. So they're still quirky, they're unusual, but we don't think very much of it. But they could have a legitimate diagnosis somewhere on the autism spectrum. Okay? And importantly, although the cause is not understood, there are many different theories abounding or hypotheses, but we know it's not contagious, and these individuals can be very rewarding to work with, and I hope that we can welcome these kids into DeMolay with open arms and give them the kind of support that they need. If you think of autism spectrum as a big umbrella, there are several different diagnoses under that umbrella as well. There's autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and a couple others. The one I'm going to focus on today is Asperger's. This is now officially, as of this past year, has been officially recategorized as a form of autism. Before it was treated as something related to autism as a distinct diagnosis. Now these individuals with Asperger's syndrome are being referred to as having autism, but they tend to be very high functioning individuals. There are many people throughout history that are thought to have had Asperger's syndrome, perhaps Einstein, Edison, a lot of the inventor types of individuals who tend to think very unusually may have had Asperger's, and many of them were also not terribly social creatures, again, very strange individuals. Asperger's is what my son has been diagnosed with as well. Traits of individuals with Asperger's. Obsessive compulsive disorder. A lot of times these kids they can be, it depends on the individual, can be very fastidious. Again, always washing hands, always organizing, always participating in ritualistic sequences of things that they just have to do things a certain way. I always tell my college students I'd be the easiest guy on earth to assassinate because every day I wake up, it is identical. It's like Groundhog Day. Day after day after day, I've got this ritual that I conduct as part of my morning routine, and God forbid anything disrupt that. That's the way these kids tend to function as well. They also tend to fidget a lot. They wring their hands, they're always doing something, they're kneading something between their fingers, they might play with their hair. That's something that my son does even now. He's 16 years of age, but from the time he was an infant, he would self-soothe by twirling his hair and humming, and he still does it now at 16. I'll go in and find him on the computer, and he'll be playing with his hair and humming to himself, but that's how he soothes himself. But you can imagine fidgeting is one of those things, for example, that could come up during ritual practice. That could create some tension or misunderstanding. Why is brother so-and-so over there? Why can't they keep their hands clasped? Why can't they sit still? It's inherent in these children that they have a hard time being still frequently. Very commonly, they also have awkward communication. A lot of times they tend to talk to a much higher audience. They sound like they're delivering a lecture or speaking among adults, even when they're speaking among their young peers. Frequently, they have a poor social filter. A lot of times, individuals with Asperger's learn only by consequence. And I remember this myself growing up. A lot of times, I wouldn't know what to say in a situation, so I would throw something out there, and then I would assess the data as it came back in. Did that create a favorable response or an unfavorable response? And then I would modify my future behavior based upon that. A lot of times I found I couldn't, and I think it's also true of a lot of these children with Asperger's syndrome, is that they can't anticipate what will happen if they do a certain act or if they say a certain thing. They just put it out there and watch what happens, and then collect that information for future use. They tend to also have poor motor skills. Okay? So I tend to think about athletic events at Conclave and what that might mean for participation of these kids in events like that, and trying our best to be inclusive, but also understanding that these are children that they're generally not athletic by nature. When we think of kind of the classic nerdy type individual who's very cerebral and maybe not very athletic, that's very often the case with Asperger's syndrome. I know my son has had educators in the past who are not aware of his diagnosis, physical educators, for example, who yelled at him for not participating, or they thought he was intentionally goofing off by not being able to kick the ball when it was rolled to him. When in fact, that was just him being him, and he had those kinds of deficits. For example, most children learn how to catch a ball at age 3. That's a developmental milestone. My son wasn't able to catch a ball until he was 8 years old, and the first ball he ever caught actually was on Father's Day, so that was a very special gift to me. They tend to also be aloof. They're the individual that frequently is not on task, and they might be attending to their own agenda. They might be very immersed in their own task. It just doesn't happen to be the right task at the moment. Lack of social skills, again, reinforced by a poor social filter. They are awkward, they tend to shy away from social events, rush parties, things of that nature. That's not necessarily their comfort zone. They have a need for sameness. They don't like change. Difficulty with transition. You've got them doing one activity, and there's another activity to follow. These are going to be the people that lag behind, and you have difficulty getting them to engage in the next activity. Like I said, they can have a certain focus when they want to, but sometimes to get them to redirect and focus in a new direction or a direction that you deem helpful at this moment is a challenge. They can have issues with hygiene. I'll tell you right now, I've sent my son to Conclave on more than one occasion where I know darn well he came back never having brushed his teeth. Sometimes perhaps never having showered like he should. So it runs the gamut from the individuals that are OCD about cleanliness to being somewhat, I guess, aloof and unaware of the need for proper hygiene. While they can be very highly organized about certain things and very particular about certain things, for example, my son has a software on our computer that counts keystrokes, so that by the end of the day he knows how many thousands of keystrokes he has put into the computer. I look at it as, I'm not sure what the value of that information is, but God forbid if anybody come within a 10-foot radius of that computer, did you touch the keyboard, he'll say. So again, very organized about certain things, but if you saw his room, it looked like a bomb went off in it. So very disorganized in other respects. Children with Asperger's syndrome tend to have high intelligence and oftentimes may have college-level intelligence despite being a young DeMolay of 12 or 13 years of age. Very frequently, we find, well, in fact, it's nicknamed Little Professor Syndrome, Asperger's is. And so it's probably no coincidence, I'm a college professor, and it's no coincidence when I went to a support group for children with Asperger's, 5 of 16 parents at the meeting were college professors. So the quirkiness tends to have probably a familial or a genetic tendency. And these individuals present with a lot of intensity. And the intensity could be with respect to, again, protecting the sameness or their organization or protecting their bubble. A lot of times they get caught up, if the more intelligent individuals get caught up really in justice and fairness, and they'll have a lot of intensity as it relates to that. Some of the other things that stand out about individuals with Asperger's, they tend to go through phases where they're really obsessive over certain things, and while we tend to think of them as being antisocial, they'll socialize, but a lot of times they want to talk to you about that one special thing. You know, my son's gone through phases where it was fossils, and for a couple of years he would just talk to you all about different fossils, or aerospace physics, or computer science. And frequently they'll talk to you literally until your ear holes hurt. You think, wow, I just can't stand to hear any more obscure facts about this particular topic. They feel overwhelmed by simple everyday tasks. So if I ask my son, I need you to get up, get dressed, I need you to mow the lawn, do this and that. If I give him more than just a handful of instructions at a time, it's overwhelming to him. He can't process, okay, what order am I supposed to do these things in, even though there's a certain logic to that would not escape most individuals. It can be very hard to carry out things orderly and sequentially like that. Sometimes it's easier for us to ask these kids to do a task at a time. Let them get through that because they have difficulty transitioning to the next activity. They tend to be worriers. They worry about sometimes things that you and I would deem to be frivolous. For example, my son's computer password. He literally was so worried about us getting into his computer, and I can't imagine what would be on his computer anyway. Maybe he's more worried about his little sister getting onto his computer, but he was literally changing his computer password every day until he forgot it. And so that's how I discovered that he'd been changing it every day. I said, well, when did you change it? Yesterday. He said, but I change it every day. I said, you change your password every day on your computer? Yes. Worry. They worry. They have difficulty paying attention and concentrating in certain environments. And sometimes they might be paying attention, but in a manner that's different. So for example, this happened just last week. My son got in trouble in math class because he was studying math. He was reading his math book. He'd missed a day of school, and he wasn't necessarily following what the instructor was saying, so he decided he cracked open his math book and went back and read the content from the previous lecture so he could try to get up to speed without having to ask any questions in class or anything like that. So he was trying to minimize, I think, the social engagement. But he got in trouble. Point being, this could be the kind of individual that gets distracted and starts reading their ritual book in the middle of a meeting when it may not be necessarily appropriate. Are super sensitive to everything around them, and that can refer to light, sound, other kinds of sensation, heat, cold. They could be the person that just, things just don't feel quite right to them. That's not uncommon at all. They may not like dances, for example. Blaring music, too much noise, too much conversation, too much interaction. And I think the thing that touches me the most is the fact that oftentimes these people feel isolated and lonely. And I speak from experience. I know I did. I know my son complains about feeling isolated and alone. I'd like to provide some examples of conversations I've had with my son over the years. Some of these even predate a diagnosis for him. For years we knew he was a little different, and it took us a lot of testing and travel to actually arrive at a concrete diagnosis for him. But I recall one time we were walking through a crowd of individuals. We were trying to reach the top of a hill where we could watch 4th of July fireworks celebrations. And as we were walking up this hill through our neighborhood, a little girl stepped out of the crowd and looked at my son, and she said, "You ride the number 9 bus." And I just stood back and watched him stare her down. And again she smiled at him, cute little girl, and said, "You ride the number 9 bus." I'd estimate my son was probably 8 years old at the time. And I leaned in and answered for him, and I said, "Yes, he rides the number 9 bus." She said, "I thought so." And as we continued walking, I said, "Alex, why did you ignore that girl? She was asking if you rode the number 9 bus." And he said, "Question?" She wasn't asking a question, she was making a statement. "You ride the number 9 bus." It's a statement. He didn't see any need to correct her. He agreed with her, so he just remained silent. So missing some of those subtle social cues. Not that it's not learnable, it's just not intuitive to these individuals. Talking about a different math teacher in a different year, my son was fortunate enough that he scored very, very well on a standardized math test and got the highest score in his school, in his grade. And he was sent to math field day to represent the school. And at the same time, he received an F in his math class. And when I met with the teacher to discuss why he had failed math, despite having such great math scores, and despite being their appointed math field day participant, it was because he wasn't doing his homework. Now, I teach, but my frame of mind is I'm always concerned about what is the outcome. What does the person perform like on examinations or a cumulative exam? And he had an A average on his quizzes and an A average on his examinations. He just wasn't organized enough to A, bring his homework to school, B, he wasn't motivated enough to sit and repeat something that he already evidently had mastered. That's how he was getting A's on his quizzes and his examinations. So they can have some difficulty conforming to society. Think about Einstein's hair. That guy was, he marched to the beat of a different drummer in many ways. Not just his hair, but his complete thought process. And oftentimes these kids are the same way. They may be unintentionally nonconformists, but with an end in mind. We rescue cats. That's one of our charities. And we have lost a number of kittens over the years that we bury behind my house. And one day, I saw my son carrying a shovel in that direction, and I asked him what he was doing. And he said, "I want to go dig up a kitten to see its rate of decomposition." Even as a scientist, I strongly discouraged him from doing that because I just thought it sounded absolutely disgusting. I said, "There are other ways to learn about this, Alex. You don't have to go dig up one of the cats that we tried to save." So I sent him back packing towards the garage with his shovel, but it was only an hour or two later that I heard chink, chink, chink. He was out there digging. Sure, I let him, and he dug it up, and then he came to me and gave me a full autopsy report of what he had discovered. So they have an intense curiosity. One day I recall sitting in the living room with my wife. I hear feet come down the stairs very, very quickly. Son comes spinning through the living room, and in passing simply says, "Don't worry, it's only a small fire." Still to this day, don't know exactly what he set on fire, nor where the fire was. So I guess, in fact, he was right that it was only a small fire. And also, a lot of times, I mentioned as well, these kids have a hard time anticipating consequences. So we were over at my in-laws' house, and they had a mole trap. Nasty device. It's like a guillotine with big spikes on it, about this tall, spring-loaded, drives spikes into the, into the cavern under the ground and basically impales the mole. I saw my son with this device, and I said, "You've got to put that down. That's dangerous. It's covered in spikes." Okay. Dirty, too, because it had been used. Sure enough, we're upstairs eating dinner. Ah! Son comes up the stairs with the mole trap through his hand. Fortunately, not perpendicular, but parallel. It had glanced through the skin and shot out the other side of the skin, but still was attached to his hand. So despite my warnings, I think despite anybody's warnings, he wanted to see firsthand how that tool operated. And he found out, but he couldn't anticipate those consequences. So I think it's important with these children, we give them enough room to make some errors that don't involve mole traps, that aren't potentially dangerous and harmful, but stand back and watch them make errors, because that tends to be how they learn. They're not as apt to take your word for it. They want to test, they want to experiment. and see how their hypothesis pans out. As you can well imagine, these kids are easy targets. They are such easy pickings for bullies because they're already socially awkward. They tend to be relatively isolated. They have these strange idiosyncrasies. And so, again, they are easy pickings for bullies, and they don't have the social skills to get themselves out of those predicaments. Are they going to wow the bully with facts? I mean, they don't know how to verbally self-defend themselves. So that's especially problematic. They may also be resistant to the idea of going to the teacher and communicating that to them, because now that involves talking yet to another person, and a lot of these kids are socially awkward and they don't necessarily want to talk to or communicate with others. I think that's where, and I don't think in DeMolay it's especially problematic, but we have to be very keen about hazing. I do recall one instance when my son had first joined DeMolay, and we got him in as soon as we could, so I assumed he was 12. And I remember I had asked about a walk-in that he'd attended. And he said, well, there were some things I couldn't participate in. I said, oh, why is that? And he said, well, it was for the 15 and older kids. I said, oh, maybe this is something new. I said, tell me more about that. He said, well, they were having a discussion, and one of the boys turned around and said to me, this is for the 15 and older kids. And he said, so I didn't attempt to participate. So he took him at his word, and of course I'm sure they were talking about something of a more mature nature or whatnot, but that was a good example, not necessarily of hazing or bullying, but how he took that at face value that, okay, I can't participate with these guys. So, now, someone with Asperger's syndrome, the Aspergian, could be a very, very good DeMolay in many respects. First of all, if we think about our scripted dialogue and the way that we stand and we monologue, much like a professor does, okay, like I am right now, there's really no need for reading social cues too much, especially when you're delivering ritual. These are the words that you're going to say, just memorize them and try to deliver them with some emotion. But outside of that, it doesn't rely on a two-way conversation. The ritualism provides that predictability and sameness that they can find very comforting. That meetings are going to proceed in a certain way. Initiations are going to proceed in a certain way with very little deviation. And I think one of the greatest things about DeMolay, of course, is the promise of brotherhood, or could we say friendship, okay? And it's not contingent upon social networking or successful socialization per se. Once you're initiated, these people promise to be your brother, promise to aid and support you. And I think that's a beautiful thing because it puts us in a situation that hopefully is far less judgmental than society at large. Again, these boys stand to be very, very good DeMolays. They might be some of the best individuals at memorizing and delivering ritual and public service ceremonies. Appears we have our first technical glitch. There we go. Here's a statistic. 80% of individuals with the diagnosis of Asperger's will not end up living independently or be able to work full time. So there's an 80% probability that my son will always live with us, may not be able to hold down a full-time job. And what's been very instructive about this is when we go to these Asperger's support groups is talking to adults with Asperger's. People in their mid-30s and 40s who have yet to really hit their stride and hold down the same job for long periods of time. And part of it has to do with that poor social filter. They frequently they may be very intelligent, they may see better ways to do things in that particular company or organization that they're working with, and they're not afraid to tell their superior about it. And frequently that will get them into trouble. So, I think it's wonderful that we have so many DeMolay and Masonic brethren, because with a little understanding about these conditions and some of the special needs that these individuals may have, can we support them and provide encouragement, provide job opportunities and whatnot within our networks, and give these people an opportunity to be successful and learn some skills while they're at it. Where I think special caution is warranted is with the concept of boys will be boys. I don't know how far back that adage goes, but I know at least at least when I was in DeMolay, and probably many decades before, that boys will be boys. Boys will be a little mischievous. Boys are probably going to talk about girls. Girls are probably going to talk about boys. The issue is that came up with my son is because he does not know how to carefully meter what he says with individuals until he gets a reaction out of somebody. It can lead to some inappropriate utterances. And so he's gotten into trouble a couple times in school for using language that was not entirely appropriate, usually directed at girls. And it was not because he was being malicious, it's just he didn't know that these are things you cannot say in school or that you should not say to someone of the opposite gender. So racy communication, I think, around these boys should be avoided, or at least tempered by a reminder that this is not the kind of language that would, leave the circle or be spoken in front of a lady. A note of patience. Patience. I'm going to kill you in my sleep. Yeah, he's going to be very bitter about this. But when children somewhere on the autism spectrum appear to be poor listeners, they're not doing what the advisors are asking them to do, they're being irresponsible with whatever it might be, time, resources, etc. They're being fidgety and you're trying to have ritual practice or you're in a competition. You've got to remind yourself these kids are not intentionally being defiant most of the time. They're not being defiant, they're being autistic. These are symptoms of their condition that you're witnessing. So your patience is warranted and greatly appreciated when you're working with these young men. And I'd like to thank DeMolay International for the opportunity to provide this presentation and hopefully a bit of personal insight into individuals with Asperger's syndrome.